Well, we're looking at three of the last pictures I painted in a series called the Lyric Suite, which were a kind of referring back to a way of painting that I was doing about 25 years ago. I wanted a very kind of lyrical landscape and a familiar painting language at the beginning of the year. For this particular series of images of people walking into a new landscape, so walking out of the picture if you like, or the idea that they were walking away from a landscape. So the question that the figure poses at the front of the picture, a kind of Eve walking into Eden or walking away from Eden, is the kind of question I was posing with this picture. And it's very much as if you're walking towards somebody, towards a new experience, you're walking away from something. Is there some kind of expulsion going on? Is this Eve-type figure walking out of Eden, or is this a figure walking towards Eden? When I was out walking one day in the February rain, and I walked by a bridge, and on top of the bridge appeared this malnourished 10-year-old in this huge parka who started to shout at me in all manner of ways, calling me an effing this and a posh that. Shouted all things about my sister and my mother, and I don't have a sister, which is quite interesting. And he was kind of abusive in a really strange and funny way, and it was almost like the prophet Elijah shouting from the wilderness at me. And at the end, I was laughing. It was so funny, and the little kid was laughing too. But straight away, this lad in this oversized parka, with this prophet-like delivery, appeared in these paintings. So it's interesting the way that my own life sort of integrates with the images, and sometimes it's difficult to see where the borderline is between the two. Right, so these, at the beginning of March, after I'd finished the Lyric Suite, there was a period of sort of experimentation in painting because I wanted to bring my world a little bit closer. And that kind of coincided with lockdown. Suddenly I went from painting these sort of vast landscapes to really concentrating on the environment that was around me, and I was doing a lot of yoga at the time and taking short walks around the local parks and things as everybody else was doing. So I decided to make a series of oil paintings which started off with a kind of very spontaneous drawing which you see in the background in black, which was a kind of improvised moment in each day. And then I would pick out particular details from these drawings with these very high chromatic oil paints. And what I found in the lockdown series was that I was looking out of my studio at the garden quite a lot and seeing the cheeky robins and the birds and various cats and things that were approaching the studio. So I found that hands and feet and birds and cups and saucers started to appear in these paintings. And when it came to picking out the details from the black and white oil drawing that was underneath, it was these sort of details that I was picking out with a great deal of sense of humour. And as an artist, you can't help but pick out those things that you're observing mostly. My studio is in a really interesting spot because it looks out across the garden, and then there's a road which leads down to a very popular woodland area and parks. So during the lockdown, the footfall down to the woods, I renamed it Centre Parks during the lockdown, became a constant stream of people who were obviously sort of discovering the place for the first time and were sort of almost in a regimented way doing their exercise. And it was kind of really interesting just kind of observing people's sort of psychic states. So I decided to make this series of expressive portraits of people who looked kind of slightly strange or somehow kind of disjointed from the world, or kind of sulky kids that were being dragged down to the woods by the parents. And so I created this series of kind of expressive lockdown portraits of folk who were just passing the edge of the garden. And quite a few people have started to kind of wave at me because they can see me at the easel, which is quite funny and makes me feel that I'm kind of part of the community. And I'm sure they now sort of realise that there's this sort of strange artist bloke working and looking out at everybody as they pass by. But I developed this really interesting technique to increase the expressive quality of the paint and density of the monochromatic colour in these. And I was looking at medieval painting, I was looking at outsider art, I was looking at people like Ferdinand Léger, Francis Newton Sousa, and people like the long-forgotten Bernard Buffet, and looking at the kind of expressive qualities in there. Some of the German expressionists as well, Kirchner, Otto Dix, and some of the surrealists as well. So there's a real ancient quality to the drawing. I was thinking of the Fayum portraits, the Coptic Egyptian portraits from medieval times. I was thinking about all those things in the making of these pictures, to give them a kind of psychic intensity, but also a sense of humour and simplicity. And I wanted to really get inside the sense of what people were feeling during lockdown. Some people had a great sense of humour about it and were very warm. Other people were very distant and kind of cold and suspicious. And others, of course, didn't give a flying fig about lockdown and just carried on their own kinds of life. You know, people in sunglasses, moody kids, old ladies and old gents kind of scuttling around at dusk and at dawn. So it was a whole series of pictures that were, in the end, imaginative renderings of the things that I was seeing just along the footpath. Well, leading from the mystical portraits and looking at a lot of medieval art, and a lot of decorative medieval art, I suddenly became interested in the idea of a kind of more narrative painting. But there weren't any specific narratives I had in mind, so it's simply a case of letting the imagery, as I improvise the drawing, provide what I've sort of entitled a group of paintings called the unspoken narratives. And it's just very, very interesting to work in a narrative way, but improvising all the time, because one ends up with images which look like stories, but aren't specific stories. And it's very, very interesting that the people that have seen these pictures have been very, very interested in kind of diagnosing their own story through the imagery. And that's always been really important to me as an artist, that the pictures have, or give an opportunity for people to live their own imaginative lives through the images that I make. So I often feel like I'm making things which are a real touchstone for the poetic sensibilities of anybody who wants to come and find their own way into the picture and find their own narrative in that picture. And it's always interesting when you're improvising, because you end up with images which are as mysterious to me at the end of the day as they would be to anybody who came to them afresh and without any kind of knowledge of the work that I make. And the technique was the same, the sort of dry brush of the wet into wet oil painting, but this time with some applied colour behind the pictures, which again I think came from the idea of stained glass and also tapestry and medieval needlework. So there are all sorts of things which sort of subconsciously feed into the way that you make these pictures. And some of the imagery references a series of etchings I made earlier on in the year. So for me it's a continual sort of reprocessing of imagery as you find new insights and new poetic meaning in the way that we all live our lives. So these are the unspoken narratives.